This is the story of how one man predicted the greatest financial disaster in American history, how Wall Street vilified him for it, and how 54 days later they lost everything, though the ending isn't quite what you'd expect. September 5th, 1929, Roger Babson stood before an audience at the National Business Conference in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and at 54 years old, this statistician delivered these exact words: "Sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific." What came next changed everything. More people are borrowing and speculating today than ever in our history, and there may be a stampede for selling which will exceed anything that the stock exchange has ever witnessed. Within an hour, his words reached Wall Street, and the market immediately dropped 3% while radio stations interrupted regular programming. More than 2 million shares traded in that final hour of trading alone. They called it the Babson Break. Wall Street didn't thank Roger Babson for his warning though, they destroyed him. Understanding why requires understanding who Roger Babson was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. Gloucester, Massachusetts gave him life in 1875, and MIT gave him an engineering degree in 1898. But while most of his classmates went to work for established firms, Babson's life took a different turn. Fall of 1901 brought tuberculosis when he was just 26 years old, and doctors told him it had seriously affected one lung and had begun to attack the other. Antibiotics wouldn't exist for decades, so his wife Grace, a trained nurse, cared for him at home, and that changed everything. Working in the city became impossible, which meant Babson started a home-based business analyzing economic statistics. $1,200 launched the Babson Statistical Organization in 1904, and his method was unusual, to put it mildly. Isaac Newton's third law of motion, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, became his tool for understanding economics. The Babson chart is what he called it. The theory seemed simple enough. Prosperity and depression moved in waves, and after a certain amount of prosperity, an equal amount of depression had to follow. Drawing a line through various economic indicators let him calculate the areas above and below, and when enough prosperity accumulated, he'd predict a downturn. Academic economists thought this was nonsense. Decades later, economist John Kenneth Galbraith would call Babson's methods hocus pocus and mysticism, but investors didn't care about academic approval. 12,000 paying subscribers had signed up by 1929, which represented roughly 1/3 of the forecasting newsletter market. Columns bearing his name appeared in the New York Times and reached an estimated 16 million readers, while subscriptions cost about $100 a year, and that was serious money in the 1920s. Wall Street knew something most people didn't though. Babson had been predicting a crash for nearly 2 years. Throughout 1927 and all of 1928, he'd warned that any major market movement should be downward, but the market ignored him and kept climbing. The profit of loss became his nickname on Wall Street. And that's when September 5th, 1929 arrived. This wasn't a bolt from the blue, but rather the boy who'd been crying wolf. Except this time, the wolf was real. 2 days before Babson's speech, September 3rd brought the Dow Jones to its peak at 381 per 17, and the market had nearly quadrupled during the 1920s while climbing over 27% for the year. $8.5 billion in margin loans, borrowed money used to buy stocks, exceeded all the currency in circulation in the entire United States. News of Babson's prediction hit Wall Street that afternoon, and the reaction came swift and brutal. What the Chicago Tribune published, it called numerous rebuffs from a host of economists and Wall Street leaders, while some questioned Babson's patriotism for making such a rash projection. One paper noted dismissively that Babson was someone to whom Wall Street has not in past years paid any particular attention. The most devastating response came from Irving Fisher though. Fisher embodied everything Babson wasn't, a Yale professor, considered the premier monetary economist of his day with academic credentials and respectability. September 5th and 6th brought Fisher's immediate counter to Babson's prediction, saying there may be a recession in stock prices but not anything in the nature of a crash. The market stabilized and Wall Street breathed easier. The profit of loss had been wrong again. October 15th arrived, just 13 days before the crash, and Irving Fisher gave a speech at the Purchasing Agents Association dinner in New York City. What the New York Times printed the next day carried his exact words: "Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau, and I do not feel that there will soon, if ever, be a 50 or 60 point break below present levels, such as Mr. Babson predicted." 6 days later, on October 21st, as the market began to wobble, Fisher doubled down by saying the market was only shaking out of the lunatic fringe. Heavy selling began on October 23rd and margin calls went out across the country. Thursday, October 24th, 1929 arrived 49 days after Babson's prediction. Opening at 305.85, the market immediately went into free fall, dropping 11% in the first hours of trading. Noon brought the top bankers in New York, organized by JP Morgan's Thomas Lamont, pooling their resources and buying stocks to stabilize prices. The strategy worked temporarily, and the market closed down only about 2%, but nearly 13 million shares had traded, and that smashed all previous records. Black Thursday is what they called it. The weekend brought no relief whatsoever. Monday, October 28th, saw the market drop 38 points for a loss of nearly 13%, while over 9 million shares traded. Tuesday, October 29th came next, 54 days after Babson's prediction, Black Tuesday. Another 30 points disappeared from the Dow as over 16 million shares traded, and the ticker tape ran 4 hours late, which meant investors were making life-altering decisions based on prices that were already obsolete. 2 days wiped out 23% of the market's value, and in dollar terms, $30 billion vanished, more than America had spent on World War I and 10 times the cost of the Civil War. General Electric peaked at 396 but fell to 210, while DuPont crashed from 217 to 80. RCA hit 505 before collapsing to 26 for a 95% loss, and the Dow, which had been at 381 just 8 weeks earlier, closed at 230. Roger Babson had been right, sort of. Here's where the story gets complicated though, because while Babson had predicted the crash, his reasons were completely wrong. Pseudoscience described his Newton-based methodology perfectly, and Galbraith would later write, "In these matters, as so often in our culture, it is far, far better to be wrong in a respectable way than to be right for the wrong reasons." Babson's vindication didn't last long either. April 1930 arrived as the market continued to fall, and Babson told investors to start buying again, but that advice, which didn't make the history books, turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The market kept falling until July 1932, when it hit 41.22 for an 89% loss from the peak, and it wouldn't return to 381 until November 1954, which was 25 years later. Irving Fisher, the man who'd mocked Babson and declared stocks at a permanently high plateau, had invested heavily on margin. His entire fortune disappeared, and he never financially recovered. Fisher maintained his reputation in academic circles, though. Babson, despite being right about the timing, remained dismissed by the establishment, and Wall Street never truly embraced him. His forecasting firm survived, but the entire industry suffered what historians call a crisis, as the aura of scientific forecasting was permanently tarnished. Life lasted until 1967 for Babson, who died at age 91 after founding Babson College, which still operates today as a top business school. Running for president in 1940 on the Prohibition Party ticket earned him nearly 58,000 votes, and in perhaps his strangest legacy, he founded the Gravity Research Foundation in 1949 because he blamed gravity for the drowning deaths of his sister and grandson. Despite its pseudoscientific origins, that foundation eventually awarded prizes to Stephen Hawking and at least 6 future Nobel Prize winners. The lesson of Roger Babson isn't that he was a genius who outsmarted Wall Street, since he'd been predicting crashes for 2 years before one finally happened, and a broken clock is right twice a day. Flawed methodology and terrible post-crash advice defined his work. What he understood, though, was something Irving Fisher and all the respectable economists didn't. When everyone is borrowing money, they don't have to buy stocks at prices that don't make sense. Something has to give. Wall Street didn't want to hear it, so they vilified the messenger, questioned his patriotism, and called his methods mysticism. 54 days later, they learned he was right, even if he was right for all the wrong reasons.